This webinar will be starting in precisely 5 minutes. This online seminar will be starting in precisely 3 minutes. This webinar will be starting in 1 minute. Hello, I'm Dr. David Wilkinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Review, and today, Wednesday the 30th of March, we're going to be having a look at one of the common myths of organisational change. This is the first in a series of online seminars that are live. Today we're going to be having a look at the myth of the 70% failure rate and exactly what is it and where the evidence is for that, that figure. Now, if you're new to this, you'll notice on your screen, you've got the main screen with the presentation. You should be able to hear me. And also there's a chat. So if you want to ask any questions at any time, if you just type into there and I can then answer you. So we'll get going. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so, Mark Twain. And in this case, this is very true. And the proposition that we're looking at today is the idea that 70% of change projects fail. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a very quick poll and to have a look at what you think the failure rate actually is of organizational change. So what I'd like you to do, just to kind of get going, is if you would like to just click on one of these, which do you think the failure rate of organizational change is? Just click on one of them, whether you think it's 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 10, or less than 10%. This is just for a bit of fun. And I'll just keep that up there if you just want to make a choice. So, 100% of people are voting for 30%. Cool. That's good. Oh, no, we've got a split now. That's interesting. 50%. Okay, 67% of the people on the webinar are saying 50%, and about a third of the people are saying 30%. I'd thought a bit more divergence. That's really interesting. Okay, so let's just have a look at what's really going on here and where this came from. So I'm just finishing off writing a book at the moment about organizational change, and I got interested in this thing about 70% failure rate. It seemed kind of high to me, really high. And I was kind of noticing it in all sorts of places, particularly some of the consultants. This is a slide share from McKinsey's, for example. They talk about 70% of transformation programs failing. This is from another slide share about 70% of efforts failing to achieve target impact, slightly different from failure. Another one, this is another thing from a management association, which was showing a very similar thing. And in fact, they're quoting a reference there from a book called Performance in Health. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, from Executive Findings. And we even find gurus such as Ken Blanchard here, talking about up to 70% of all change initiatives fail. So this is a very common figure that's bandied around. We hear about it an awful lot. And when I was doing the research for the book, I started to come across this 70% failure rate in lots of different areas. Project managers talk about 70% of projects failing. We get the same with IT and infrastructure projects. They talk about 70% of their projects failing. Training events, even, I've heard that 70% of training events do not fail. They don't achieve their objectives. New sales initiatives was another area that I discovered. Marketing campaigns also use this figure of 70% failure rate, and regeneration projects and coaching engagements. Now, it sounds like 70% of almost everything we do in organizations fails, and that's not my experience. So I started to get a little bit suspicious about this kind of 70% rate. So my background actually is as a police officer. So I decided to go off and actually find out what was really going on. Now, before we do, I just want to have a quick word about the sources of research within academia, and particularly how we decide to trust a source over another source that we decide not to trust. And largely what we're doing is, when we're looking at an academic paper and research, we're looking particularly at two things. We're looking at the validity and the reliability of the research. Now, the validity means, is this thing actually measuring or describing what it suggests it is? And are the tools that it's using and the ways that it's looking to analyze all of that, are they valid for the purpose? And then reliability just means that we can actually repeat this and that the experiment or the way of looking at it is repeatable. And if you've got high levels of validity and high levels of reliability, we then tend to trust that source. So what we're looking at here is not just is there evidence, but also how good is that evidence? Now, what happens in academia is that the research journals are kind of clustered into what we call impact factors. So the highest research journal that there is in the world is Nature. You've probably heard of this. It crops up in news items on the papers and things like that. And it has what is known as an impact factor of 41.456 right now today. That's the highest impact factor. It means that it's of all of the organizations, it's not a percentage. So of all of the journals, that 41 is the highest score that you can get in terms of trust. We tend to trust most things that are printed in Nature because they've been through a very rigorous process of quality assurance. Now, at the other end, the lowest journal, may surprise you, is the Harvard Business Review, and that has an impact factor of 1.27. Most of the things in the Harvard Business Factor, not everything, but most of the things in the Harvard Business Reviews are not considered to be academic research. They're largely opinion pieces, and certainly from a research perspective, they have low impact and low trust levels. So I just want to put that into context because it informs what we're about to see about this 70% and where it came from. So I got on the trail, and over the period of a few months, I looked at almost 1,000 references going back over 20 years to try and find out where this 70% came from. The most quoted source is from 1996. John Kotter, who's famous, very famous, published a thing in the Harvard Business Review, bearing in mind what we've just said about impact factors, called Leading Change, Why Transformation Efforts Fail. So if you look at references to the 70%, the most frequent quoted reference is this one. So let's have a look at what it says, bearing in mind where it's been printed anyway. So there's a lot of words here, so I'll read it out because it becomes quite important. So what Kotter actually says in this paper is this: over the past decade, I've watched more than 100 companies. Now, it says watched here. It doesn't mean that he's actually been doing the research. But anyway, watched more than 100 companies try to remake themselves into significantly better competitors. They've included large organizations like Ford and small ones, Landmark Communications. Companies based in the United States, General Motors, and elsewhere, British Airways. Corporations that were on their knees, Eastern Airlines, and companies that were earning good money, Bristol Myers Squibb. These efforts have gone under many banners: total quality management, re-engineering, right-sizing, restructuring, cultural change, and turnaround. But in almost every case, the basic goal has been the same: to make fundamental changes in how business is conducted in order to help with new, more challenging market environments. A few, and this is important, a few of these corporate change efforts have been very successful. A few, again, have been utter failures. Most fall somewhere between, with a distinct tilt towards the lower end of the scale. That's what Kotter says. Nowhere does he talk about a 70% failure rate. And this isn't research. This is his opinion based on these 100 companies that he's watched. So we're not talking research here. We're talking about an observation. May be valid, may not be, but there's no research validity. So we've got no mention of a 70% failure rate. But yet it is the most sourced reference for the 70%, even though it's not mentioned. So, and it's important what he says here. So, and then I found this quote, which is: most major change initiatives, whether intended to boost quality, improve culture, or reverse a corporate death spiral, generate only lukewarm results. That's most. Many fail miserably. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because it's actually attached to the paper from Kotter. When you read it, actually, these aren't Kotter's words. What they are is the editor's introduction to Kotter. So what we've got here is not what Kotter says. Kotter says, as we remember, a few of these corporate change efforts have been very successful. A few have been utter failures, and most fall somewhere in between with a distinct tilt towards the end, to the end of the scale. He doesn't say what the editor says, but this is the editor's introduction. So we're now starting to see where at the thin end of the wedge. What Kotter does then say a little bit later on in this paper is well over 50% of the companies I've watched fail in this first phase. Now, what he's talking about there is whether they create a sense of urgency for change. If anybody knows anything about Kotter, his first phase of organizational change is you've got to create a sense of urgency. But this isn't saying that 50% of organizations fail in terms of change, they just fail to create a sense of urgency, that's all. Then let's roll forward a little bit to 1993 and this book, Re-engineering the Corporation. And this is the second most quoted source of the 70%. So let's have a look at what Hammer and Champney say. Sadly, we must report that despite the success stories described in the previous chapters, many companies that begin re-engineering don't succeed at it. Our unscientific estimate, again, this is just an observation, is that as many as 50 to 70% of the organizations that undertake a re-engineering effort do not achieve the dramatic results they intended. Again, no research, it's an observation, and what they're not saying is it's failure, they're just saying that actually they don't achieve the dramatic results they intended. And you'll see this playing out in a minute or two. Now, the third most quoted source for the 70% is this paper, Cracking the Code of Change, by Nahira and Beer. A very famous paper, published in 2000. Also published in the Harvard Business Review, bearing in mind with the proviso of what I said about impact factors. Again, this isn't research. And what they say is this: the brutal fact is that about 70% of all change initiatives fail. This is the very first reference to 70% of change initiatives failing. And then you look for the evidence. Where has this statement come from? What's it based on? And what we discover is it's a statement on its own. There's no source, no research, and no evidence. Interesting. So we now have the very first quote about 70% of change initiatives, but we don't know where it's come from, apart from it's just a sentence in the middle of an opinion piece about change. So let's just move on to 2008. Now, in 2008, a self-published white paper by a management consultancy company, Bain & Company, published this. And this is where the 70% now starts to enter into the popular mythology. What they say in their white paper is people have been writing about change management for decades, and still the statistics haven't improved. With each survey, they don't reference any surveys, 70% of change initiatives still fail, but there's still no reference to any survey. We'll go forward a year. And now we get to, this is how things have kind of snowballed into this 70%. And we get a paper that's published by Aitken and Keller, who are consultants at McKinsey's. And the paper is called The Irrational Side of Change Management. And this is really interesting. What they say is this: in 1996, John Kotter published Leading Change. Now, we've already referenced that. Considered by many to be the seminal work in the field of change management. Kotter's research revealed that only 30% of change programs succeed. We already know what Kotter says, and it certainly wasn't that. if you remember, what Kotter actually said is a few of these corporate change efforts have been very successful. A few have been utter failures. Most fall somewhere in between with a distinct tilt towards the lower end. He doesn't mention any research, because there isn't any. It's his opinion. And, as I've said, he doesn't talk about the 70% at all. And yet they're referencing it. They also go on to say this. In 2008, a McKinsey survey of 3,199 executives around the world found, as Kotter did, which he didn't, that only one transformation in 3 succeeds. Now, I got quite excited at this. I thought, oh, first time we've got some research. It's McKinsey research, but let's go and have a look at it. So I did. So what I'd like you to do is, before we go on to that research, is just have a little look at this. So we've got 4 statements here. The first statement is the change is extremely successful. The second statement is the change is very successful. The third statement is the change is somewhat successful. And the fourth one is not successful at all. So my question for you is, which of these, from where would you start to describe things as being a failure? We'll put another poll up. So if you just choose the one that you think starts to describe failure, I know it sounds like a bit of a strange thing to ask you to do, but I'm making a point here, so you'll see. So just choose which one, and we'll see what happens. Yes, okay. What I suspected everybody is saying, not successful at all equals failure. Yep. Okay, that's exactly how I would put it, and that's exactly how I would see it. So let's just have a little look at what actually is going on in this paper. Now, you don't need to read all of this. In the report that I'm going to send you a copy of, you'll get this. But what I've done is I've moved that into some actual figures. The first thing to notice is in here, when you look at these figures, they're not all of the figures. So they're talking about this 2,314 people, executives. We don't really know whether they're executives because in the actual paper they don't talk about this. And what they've done is they've removed all the respondents who answered, I don't know. And what I calculated that to be is about 15% of all the respondents said they don't even know whether the change was extremely, very, somewhat successful or not successful. And that's what they were looking at. So what I've done is I've tabulated the data to have a look. So these people here are saying 1,399 that were left. 4.88% were saying the change was extremely successful. 30.51 were saying very successful. 48.96 was somewhat successful. Doesn't sound like failure to me. And 5.87%, let's round it up to 6, saying not successful at all. So the question here is, what are we talking about in terms of failure? Because somewhat successful doesn't sound like a failure to me, and it certainly doesn't sound like a failure to everybody who's on this webinar. And it starts to call into question. So let's just go back to what this paper, McKinsey paper, said. In 2008, the McKinsey survey, and this is the one we've just been looking at, around the world found, as Kotter did, that only one transformation in 3 succeeds. That's not what those figures from that paper says, and it's certainly not what Kotter was saying, which is interesting. We go back to what Kotter said. A few have been utter failures. He doesn't put a figure on it, and he certainly doesn't say only 30% succeed. And this is how things start to grow, because particularly organizations like consultancies want it to be true, because it would be really useful if it is true. But we come back to this question about, so what is success? How do we define it? Now, interestingly, there's some research already being done on this. And what we find is that there's some researchers from the Department of Business and Economics at a university in Finland did a large-scale survey to find out what organizations counted as success, and they found that there were largely two levels of success. For small firms and one-person businesses, success was survival. For large firms, usually of more than kind of 10 people, was profit, making a profit, and then increasing profit. But largely the term of success was boiled down to that. And that was about it, as in terms of whether they were successful. Now that's in terms of businesses. What they also found was in terms of services, the services went back to survival. So if they weren't profit making, surviving was considered to be a success, particularly in the current economy. This was a study that was published in 2007. And then this is backed up actually by a paper that was printed, published earlier this year, 2016, by Jeffrey Pfeffer. Now he's from Stanford, so we're not talking about a flaky academic here. This professor's high, right? And he published a paper in the Journal of Management Studies earlier this year called "Why the Assholes Are Winning: Money Trumps All." And what he found was really interesting, and this comes back to this idea of what organizations consider to be success. He found that only 4 companies made Fortune, which is a large business magazine in the States, made both Fortune's most admired by other CEOs, we're talking here, and the best places to work list in 2015. So what does this mean? What he found was that admiration from other CEOs, so it's not admiration from anywhere else, but admiration from other CEOs for the business, and criteria of organizational success boils down to this: financial success in terms of stock price appreciation and wealth creation. And he went on to say, and that largely the people in the organization, to the CEOs, only matter in as far as they are able to deliver financial returns. So usually what we're talking about when we talk about success for a criteria for change is whether it actually enhances profit or not for these large ones, or whether it keeps somebody surviving for a small one, which isn't really the kind of criteria that most people in organization development would actually like to kind of have a look at. So let's just go back to this 70% thing. So we already know that the primary sources that are quoted the most actually aren't research. There is an interesting paper that in my kind of thing that came out in 2011. Mark Hughes, who's a professor at the University of Brighton in the UK, had a look at failure rates of organizational change programs through other pieces of research. And he found this: whilst the existence of a popular narrative of 70% organizational change failure is acknowledged, there is no valid and reliable empirical evidence to support such a narrative. So there we have it. Not only is there no evidence that 70% of change programs fail, what little evidence we do have, which is the McKinsey's own survey, suggests that failure rate of organizational change is most likely to be around 6%. And that's being nice, largely because I think our criteria of what success and failure is around profit and survival, and we have a problem with doing that. So firstly, what I'd like to do is take any questions. The question is too assumptive. Okay, that's JB. How do you mean the question is too assumptive? Which question? The one about 70%, or can you just repeat that, JB, please? And whilst we're doing that, are there any other questions at all? And what I'll do is I'll show you where you can get the report from. So you can download that now. So if you've got any other questions. Oh yeah, it was a yes. I know it's way too assumptive about, what are we talking about here? Now, if you'd like more about the Oxford Review, what we do is we're putting a lot of the kind of academic jargon and these papers and things into research that people can understand. And our members get up-to-the-date research intelligence 1 to 3 times a week. And special reports like this one. In fact, this one got sent to our members about a month ago. And also the Oxford Review every month. And you get to be the person to say, have you read? There's some research about that. And I know some research about this, which is quite a nice position to be. And you become the most up-to-date, impressively well-informed person around. So what I've done is I've put a thing up for you where you can get that one. And I'll put this up. If you go onto the website, which is www.oxfordreview.com, and it's oxford-review.com. If you go in there and on the menu bar at the top, just go to the end and there's a special offer there. What I've done is I've done half price for people who are on this one. So you can get 50% off right now for the rest of the evening. And then that's going to close. Are there any other comments? I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. This is the first in a series of such presentations. The first ones that I'm actually going to do are these kinds of myths. There's another one that I'm going to do in a couple of weeks' time, which is about the myth of the change curve and whether it really is a myth or not. Somebody published something online a couple of weeks ago saying that the change curve is a myth, so I went off and did some research about that. So I hope you enjoyed the session, and if there's anything I can do, I'll help you. Here's the special offer. You just need to click on there and it'll give you a code for 50% off the Oxford Review. That's just tonight. Once that's finished, then it's back to the normal price for these people. Hope you've enjoyed the session. I said I'd keep it short and simple, so we're just over 20 minutes. And if there's any questions, I'll be here for another 3 or 4 minutes. Fire away and have a good evening. Yeah, if you want the slides, if you just email me at david.wilkinson. In fact, I'll put it on here. I'll put it on the chat. I meant to put it as an upload. So, but if you email me here, at oxford-review.com, and I'll send you a copy of the slides if you want. You've already got the report, and all the references are in the report as well, but I'm very happy to send you the slides if you want those as well. So just ping me an email and I'll send you a download link to that. And that's it. I hope you have a good evening and I'll talk to you soon.